This is a terrific new book. I've enjoyed it since before it came out. You started off with a big lead essay in the Wall Street Journal. And what I want to do to start off, I suspect most people here have read it. If they haven't, they're about to. Give us the short version of the book. What's your book about?
I'm not good at the short version. That's just a problem in life. I think we're not doing enough to celebrate scar tissue. So I think our kids live at a unique moment in history where adolescence, which is a gift, has drifted into this new category, perpetual adolescence, and we don't have a lot of categories to think about it. So the book is not blame laying. It's about 1/3 stage setting, and we're not beating up on millennials here, but we want to understand the situation into which they're emerging. And then 2/3 of it is trying to be constructive and thinking about habit formation as what should happen to teens. It shouldn't just be that your late single-digit years and your teen years are spent progressing through grades in school, and then when you're not in school, you're doing different kinds of consumption. There should be certain kinds of habit formation and rites of passage that we're transitioning through, and I don't think we're reflecting enough on why we're failing to do that well.
And why do you think that this is a problem for America? I mean, you could factually say that these things are occurring. I mean, my goodness, we all know that you can stay on your parents' insurance until you're 26 at this point. Why? And I fully predict my kids will be on my insurance till they're 26. But what's the problem with that? Who cares?
Yeah, so the book is 100% not about politics, and it's 99% not about policy, but it is definitely about America. This isn't just about individual families struggling with this. By the way, the fastest growing genre of self-help now is apparently the failure to launch literature, parenting your 35-year-old, trying to nudge your 32-year-old out of the nest. There's a whole bunch of stuff about intergenerational families, if intentionally chosen, that are great, but that's not what's happening right now. This is sort of accidental drift. That's bad for a republic because we need actual adults to rise up and govern and rule and exercise self-discipline, self-control, self-restraint. And we need to celebrate those virtues of actual adulthood. Childhood is to be celebrated, be protected. It's a dependent stage where there's all sorts of innocence that we want to protect them from. But our goal is ultimately to get our kids into adulthood, not to have them stranded in Neverland. Peter Pan is a dystopian hell. And we need to remember that. Disney tried to remake it as if it's a desirable thing to be a 15-year-old forever. It's not. And right now, we have trouble distinguishing between 10 and 15 and 20 and 25-year-olds too much of the time. A lot of those people aren't yet really ready to help govern and serve.
Peter Pan, my friends, is a dystopian hell.
More beer?
That's right. And the Jungle Book is the 7th layer of Hades. We're totally getting taken to court by Disney.
We're going to do a Straussian reading of all comic books shortly.
That may be the quote of the night.
I hope we get better than that, brother.
How long have you been working on this? I mean, this can't be of a concern of yours just since you joined the U.S. Senate. I mean, you must have been thinking about this for a long time.
Yeah, so I was a college president from 2009 until being elected in November of 2014. And I probably started thinking about this as a book project in 2012. But it originates in my mind at my arrival at this college. So I took over a 130-year-old liberal arts college in Nebraska because I was a turnaround guy. I mean, this college in this town, it's where I grew up. My parents met there. You know, it's the sort of cultural and real estate hub of the town I grew up in, and it was in financial trouble, and I'm a turnaround guy, and I live down the street. So I was 37 when I became a college president. Nobody was hiring me because I supposedly had great insights into student affairs. I mean, I wasn't there to help rebuild student culture. I was there to restructure the debt and think about expansion opportunities and marketing and buying another school and getting to scale, but it wasn't student life. And yet I found that student life was the thing that I'd wake up in cold sweats about. Because as I was getting to know our students, and lots of wonderful human beings, but I didn't think of myself as generationally that different from them. I was 37. And they were 18. My kids were, half the age of our college students. So I didn't think of myself as having a big gap. And yet, as I got to know them, one of the most obvious differences is that when I went off to college in 1990, basically everybody I graduated high school with, whether college bound or not, and basically everybody I got to college with, whether they were from a sort of lower middle class family like mine or if they were wealthy, everybody had done some sort of meaningful work. And the kids that were coming into our college, by and large, had never done any work of any kind. And this wasn't a socioeconomically wealthy school. It was just that they were living 20 years later at a time when the work-home separation had become deeper and when the sort of material prosperity of the nation as a whole had become richer, and they had largely been insulated from work. And I was looking around at the people that I found really interesting in life and the kinds of people that you wanted to have dinner with and the kind of people you wanted to rely on and the kind of people you wanted to be in shared projects with. And almost all of them could talk in a meaningful way about where they got their work ethic. Where did they ever first work really hard? And there was something different happening for these kids. And it scared me. That was fear is the motive of this book.
Yeah. It takes its place in the fear-based literature, and reading this is pretty alarming. And there's it's full of statistics. It's jammed with stats that back up your point. So, just to kind of give the scale of the problem, what's your favorite statistic from this book that makes the thesis you think most effectively?
Well, most of it is this drift from teens to 20-somethings, but the statistic that does scare the living daylights out of me is 41% of Americans under age 35 now think that the First Amendment is dangerous because you might use your freedom of speech to say something that would hurt someone else's feelings. And that's kind of the point of America, is that we believe in things that are so much more fundamental than government, that government exists to provide a framework for ordered liberty so that you can wrestle with things of the soul and of the mind at the dinner table and trying to persuade people to buy your product or join your venture philanthropy project at the Rotary or join your church or synagogue. Like the center of life is the town square and the persuasion environments and the dinner table. And if we start to think of government as something that should squeeze out difference, well, the whole cultural pluralism experiment that America's about starts to atrophy and drift. And then there's a yearning for more power to fill that vacuum. And so what I'm really worried about in a public policy building like this is the implications of not understanding the sort of vigor and vitality and potential to persuade and to argue and to really become fully formed adults that have the scar tissue and the resilience to get through those times of disagreement and dissent and recognize that there's going to be diversity in a fallen world.
So hurting somebody's feelings is equivalent to the modern generation of shouting fire in a crowded theater. It should be the way that we can't use our First Amendment rights, and that's what really gives you pause, obviously. And I think that anybody who's paying attention can see this lack of scar tissue, this lack of toughness on campuses all over America today. Extraordinary to see the movement of students to shut down people's free expression, to shut down the free exchange of ideas. Charles Murray is here in the back. He's become the poster child for intolerance and indeed a sort of proto-fascism on college campuses, not allowing people to talk in the first place. How do you see those links? I mean, you were teaching at Midland University, which presumably didn't have an unbelievably active student base trying to shut down people like Charles Murray, but did you see that lack of mental toughness among your students?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Charles's experience at Middlebury is something we could unpack for a long time, but just we should fundamentally say to 18 to 22-year-olds, if you're not going to encounter ideas that you didn't already hold, why are you paying tuition? Like that's kind of the fundamental point of going to school and being educated is encountering ideas you didn't already hold. Right? I mean, I'm going to sometimes be persuaded, sometimes I'm going to persuade, but if I learn how to persuade after having wrestled with an idea that I didn't already hold, I'm going to refine my own arguments and my own understanding. So that's the marketplace of ideas. But I also do think that there's adjacent to that a kind of psychological protection that isn't just intellectual protection. It is a sense that there is a kind of cocoon element to becoming 18, 19, 20, 21, where I think we should want to be seeing the diverse debate in the marketplace of ideas of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds crowding back down into 12th, 11th, 10th, and 9th grade. I don't think we should be making college more like high school. I think we should ultimately be making high school more like college.
Let's get into the meat of the book. You basically have two themes in this book. First is parenting, and the second is American decay. And so let's start with parenting. You talk about production, not consumption, being the key to happiness. We call it earned success as opposed to materialism here at AEI. How do you teach production as opposed to consumption?
Well, I think, first of all, there's about 2.5 chapters of this book that feel like they might just be an Arthur Brooks book report. There's sort of a whole bunch of places where I gloss conservative mind for pages on end, and I don't have footnotes, I have endnotes, and I just say at the end of each chapter, and just go see Arthur Brooks for further expansion on this idea here.
It's well written, by the way. I highly recommend the endnotes to all of you for your...
Well played. So I do think that it is natural to feel in your belly the distinction between production and consumption. And then of consumption, you should feel the difference between need and want. You should, of course, cognitively know the difference between need and want, but you should over time also feel it. Because, 4 of the key inputs to happiness that you talk about a lot in your speeches is people tend to be happy if they have a family, if they have a few Aristotelian friendships, I think your term for it is usually community, if they have meaningful work, and if they have a theological framework to make sense of death and suffering. Well, a number of those things run pretty closely together, but in the work bundle, there is a distinction between what consumption is for, and there are all sorts of wonderful things that we should want to consume in the world. It's also useful to go back to kind of old Puritan language where people in America past used to wrestle with the distinction between leisure and recreation. Because leisure has a danger, right? Leisure can drift to sort of a luxury that makes you soft and weak. Recreation is at least telling you that lots of this is a means to an end. Right? I want to rest in the evening. I want to have a good meal. But one of the most basic reasons you want to do it is to be revivified so that tomorrow I can go out and love my neighbor again and produce and work and serve. And I think right now we have insulated our kids. Again, this has not been a cognitive choice that a lot of people have made. A lot of it's just a byproduct of our wealth, that we live in the richest time and place in human history. But a lot of our kids don't know that distinction about work being the place where you're going to find a lot of your joy and a lot of your satisfaction in life. And I worry that we're accidentally teaching our kids that they should try to be free from work, when what good parenting and good neighborliness is about helping them realize that they should find freedom in their work. There's all sorts of wonderful things to be found in terms of the meaning of important production that benefits your neighbor. And I think too often we're trying to help them think that the way we love them is keeping them free from work. I don't want my kids to be free from work. I want them to suffer. Because I want them to realize
you can make them watch Peter Pan over and over again.
It's a form of work indeed.
It's one of the big debates that we've got going in America today. I mean, who among us would not agree that work should be an ordinary, hard work should be a good and sanctified thing? But we have an argument going on in this country today that some work is good and some work is lousy, and that some work, they're dead-end jobs and they're terrific jobs, and everybody wants their kid to get these good jobs, but you don't want your kid to be working a minimum wage or stocking shelves or something. And there's this natural dichotomy that comes. Is it all sanctified? How should we be seeing this? How should we be talking about it today?
Yeah, I fundamentally reject the idea that there's good work and there's bad work. There's work that actually benefits your neighbor, or there's pointless stuff you shouldn't do, right? And if you're doing something that benefits a real human neighbor, that's a wonderful way to live out a life of gratitude and to love your neighborhood and your community and actual people, and to develop toughness and to view that as one of the means to the end. One of the uses of work is me toughening myself up and humbling myself. And our kids are 15, 13, and 6. Last year, when our oldest was 14, we decided that, there was a little too much creature comfort in her life. And Nebraska is the largest cattle state in the Union. And so we had lots of opportunities to ship her off. That was close. To ship her off and have her suffer a little bit. And
it almost just cost me $100,000 from the FCC. One more cuss word, and we're going to be put out of business. Yeah,
I'm going to have a wardrobe malfunction in a half an hour, so we're really going to push the limits.
No, not bad. That'll be the third one this week.
Charles Murray's been up here again, huh? Anyway, we sent our daughter out to a cattle ranch in central Nebraska where they were going to deliver 600 baby cows over the course of a month. And March in Nebraska is often really miserable. I mean, it often doesn't get up to zero. And if you're a mama cow giving birth to a baby cow at 3 a.m., especially if it's your first time, you could have distress in labor, you could wander away from the calf can get frostbite on its ears. Even failing to tag which calf came from which mama can cost you a whole bunch of money, because almost all these are artificially inseminated cows, and so you got to know which one was incubated where to get all the payout from. It's a high-tech business. And so my daughter had to be driving a pickup truck all over this ranch in the middle of the night to find these cows and dry off their ears. And she had to don a rubber glove up to her shoulder. She didn't know she might lose a watch on this work experiment. This was a new thing for her. And so she's sending me back all these text messages of just the ick factor of a 14-year-old girl developing a work ethic. And this stuff was hilarious. And so I would turn her texts into tweets, and I just made up the hashtag from the ranch. And I would just ship these out to the world. And this became a viral event in Nebraska. And this was March and April of last year, at a time when I was critical of the frontrunners of both political parties in the country. And as I was traveling Nebraska, I thought a lot of what I was going to hear was Nebraskans' frustration with me for not being all on board with the Republican nominee. And almost everywhere that I went, the only thing people wanted to talk about was my daughter suffering and how their kids could suffer too.
You talk a lot about, and I want to come back to suffering here in a second, because that's actually one of the things the idea of sort of mortifying yourself in a way to become stronger. It's sort of the peanut allergy metaphor that's so apt. I mean, the fact that when you and I were kids, nobody had peanut allergies that we're aware of, or maybe they just died, I don't know. But sorry. Either way, it was tougher back then. And today, I mean, most the common belief is that kids have peanut allergies today because they're protected from peanuts, and so they're not administered something in which they might have an allergy. And so you talk about that an awful lot. And I want to come back to this concept of toughening people up through the therapeutic use of some amount of suffering. But I want to go to another quick theme now that you talk about an awful lot, which is mixing generations. And this really captured my imagination a little bit. I mean, it's sort of true. I mean, I suspect you don't think we should all be in one-room schoolhouses and where all the ages are mixed, or maybe you do. I mean, in point of fact, we're in cohorts. When you see a lot of young guys together, young boys together who are all the same age, getting crazier and crazier. It sort of evokes images of the Lord of the Flies. Mm-hmm. There's not a civilizing effect that comes from mixing the generations. Talk about that a little bit more, and what we should do, what the salutary impact would be of mixing the generations more.
Yeah, if you had sort of a time travel machine and people from 10,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago dropped in on us today, and what would be strange to them? What would startle them? I think the first thing would obviously be just our material abundance, right? They didn't have a world where their built environment was as rich and fulsome as ours, and they obviously didn't have any understanding. They had no digital experiences. So clearly the first shell shock you'd have is just material production and consumption and sort of bounty. But I think 30 days after they were here, the thing that would most shock people from other times and places about the way we live is how generationally segregated we are. No one has ever really lived like this. The rise of sort of mass factory model schooling where you have clear, rigid, birth year-based segregation, nobody's ever really lived this way before. And I think it's strange in that it creates in us a belief that the pure culture of the moment, we live so immediately. We live in this second. We have so little wisdom. We have so little history past. We have so little sense of future long that I think when, again, teenage daughters at my house appear slight to a 15-year-old girl or a 13-year-old girl or a 13-year-old boy, if that's what you have, feels like it's the biggest thing in the world if all you know is 13-year-olds, right? And if you know 80-year-olds, it's just kind of weird to obsess about a weird 13-year-old saying something cruel for 5 minutes. And so I think it builds wisdom to have intergenerational relationships. It also helps you understand the progression of different stages and phases of life and types of love and types of service and the body. We live in a broken world where our bodies are going to decay and decline, and we act as if the fountain of youth is almost within our grasp because 22-year-olds are only around 22-year-olds. So something might be tragically wrong with their body and their mind because there's 2% deviance from another 22-year-old, right? And that's not normal. And so the book is structured, again, 1/3 stage setting, 2/3 constructive habit formation. How can we do right by our kids? How can we help them grow up in ways that will make them wiser and better able to serve, better able to love this creation? And so the 5 habit-forming things are develop a work ethic, experience limited consumption once in a while, have intergenerational relationships, travel, and learn to actually read. And what a lot of these things have in common, frankly, is they shock you out of the moment where you believe that the thing and the peer set and the experience or the struggle that you're having in that moment is an eternal thing. It's not. Traveling and learning to read and having intergenerational relationships all have something in common, which is it's like the fish who is the antidote to the fish who can't explain what it's like to be in water because he's never been outside of water. When you read about a different time and place, when you travel to a different place, when you talk to people who've lived through different stages and times and places, all of a sudden you have a lot more appreciation for the complexities of this world and the benefits.
Mm-hmm. One of the criticisms I think that people could make, if they're looking for one, is that we're talking about kind of a simulacrum for suffering.
I have no idea what that means.
That means that we're simulating the suffering. It's we're setting up conditions in which kids have to suffer, or which they have to experience some mental toughness or physical toughness. And there are a lot of poor people in America who face really hard circumstances every single day, where the parents don't have to simulate it. I mean, it's great that we could be in a circumstance where we all have so much bounty that we could try to withdraw some of it such that kids understand that there is a little bit of suffering. But what do you say to that criticism about all the kids who are in real conditions of hardship? Is that a good thing, or how do we see the difference between these things?
Great and fair question. Clearly there are some families, and you can think of a bunch of immigrant communities in America, where people do grow up actually around work. And what you find when you travel to those communities and interview people in those places is a recognition of some of the virtue and the character that is inculcated from having that shared work. And so, first of all, not minimizing any of the suffering point you make about people who actually have worry about whether or not there's going to be food on the table tomorrow. So lots of sympathy for that. But I think in those communities, there's a lot that we can learn about the shared experience of working together. But this problem isn't a problem that's just sort of an upper class or an upper middle class problem. We live in a world that's saturated with digital life, and these digital natives often have new kinds of consumption potential, which is a way of thinking about an expanded denominator for all that you might consume. And one way of thinking about happiness, which I think I'm sort of partly ripping off from you, from something I've heard you say in the past, is one way to think about happiness, pardon me. It's kind of a fraction of needs met over perceived needs. And when you're talking about actual needs, not wants, when you're talking about the things that really need to happen for you to live a full life, if you have a thought out denominator of the real needs in your life, when those needs are met, there's great gratitude. There are all sorts of uses of things in life, but there's also just basic enjoyment and developing the habit of gratitude. And you want to have that denominator able to be fulfilled. And one of the ways to fulfill it is to strive more and more and more to fill up the numerator. But the more prudent thing is to make sure your denominator doesn't grow too fast and start to confuse wants for needs, because the yearning of our appetites are limitless. And if you come to think that that is normal for your denominator to just grow, you're never actually going to have an equation that has very much earned success and therefore not much gratitude, just lots more Ecclesiastes like yearning for more, and it's always the next stage of life. It's always the next promotion, it's the next title, it's the next raise where someone will finally think, I'm going to be satisfied. And then boom, something happens at middle age, and all of a sudden it's always behind you, the thing that you're yearning for. If only I could go back a little bit and get rid of these regrets. If only I could go back and be a little bit younger. If my knees could ache a little bit less, if I could have a little more virility, then I'd be happy. ultimately, there's a lot of chasing after the wind.
You know, as you well know, our great friend, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, spends time at AEI when he's in Washington, and I've interviewed him a bunch of times on the stage. And one of the things he's told me is that the secret to happiness sounds an awful lot like what you said. He said that what people get wrong is that they strive their whole lives to have what they want, but the real secret to happiness is wanting what you have. So, and you just said that too. So from now I'm going to call you His Holiness Senator Sasse.
I'm just trying to think how my kids would mock that. So
yeah, that's right. Well, you know, I think the robe would look good on you, by the way. And shave your head, and then we'll have more in common.
You're making progress on yours.
I know. It's not right, but he just said it anyway. Let's talk about what's going on in America, as opposed to just parenting. Let's talk about general trends in the United States. You talk a lot about our failing educational system, and this is a big deal for us here at AEI. It's a big deal for anybody who pays attention to American public policy. It's a scandal what's going on in America, particularly in the public schools. Clearly, fixing this is really near to your heart. Give me some practical suggestions on what we could do today to fix the American education system.
Well, I'm not going to go all the way to policy because I very self-consciously wanted to write this as a book that enables us to have a conversation that's upstream from policy and politics. So let's talk about some of the culture of our schools before we bracket from this conversation tonight particular federal policy levers. But I think culturally it's really important to recognize that you can believe deeply in public funding of education, as I do, and still say there should be room for skepticism of the homogenization of institutional form. John Dewey is really the only true bad guy in this book. I wrestle a lot with, I can't stand that guy. There's a lot about Rousseau I don't like, but I still really enjoy wrestling with him. So Rousseau's Emile shows up through the book again and again and again.
You trashed Peter Pan, too. Pretty bad. That's right.
Is that exactly a guy?
Oh,
but
he's not real?
We'll talk afterwards.
Okay.
But Dewey is the father of the modern American secondary school. And it's just useful to have a historical footprint that 2% of Americans were high school graduates at the end of the Civil War. 78% of Americans are high school graduates by the end of World War II. Today, it's only a bit over 80%. So we haven't really changed that much from the 1940s till today. But during industrialization, we rapidly created a kind of factory model school on a factory model because there was lots of fear about what you do to occupy kids' time. And so even though prohibition was obviously insanely bad policy, it's useful to understand why we got prohibition. There actually were lots of drunk Irish 15-year-old kids in the streets, right? So there was a fear, what are we going to do to occupy people's time? And I don't think we do a good enough job of recognizing that the kind of schooling that we have now is partly about creating a warehouse to hold people. And on net, secondary education is to be celebrated. On net, secondary education, mass secondary education has been a very good thing. But I think we have to recognize it as on net. It's not an unmitigated good. And right now, so I want to talk a little bit more about secondary education, but let's also recognize there's a drift toward trying to re-envision tertiary education on a secondary school model. 41 of 50 governors in America now are starting to talk about P16, preschool through grade 16, as opposed to the old kindergarten to grade 12 bureaucracy, right? Preschool versus kindergarten, early childhood literacy, intervention for kids that are in tough environments. There's a lot of meaningful debate we can have there. Grade 13, I think, is just a disastrously bad idea, right? We want to be we can celebrate grade 9 and wonder if it's as good at grade 11 and then think something's really wrong if we're still doing this passive model of schooling at grade 13. And I don't think taking our vital 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids and having them sedentary inside most of the waking hours, Monday through Friday, is something that we should just receive without a little bit of skepticism. And so I think it yields a kind of passivity where Socrates was right about the fact that people who ask questions are now in a different posture as a learner. There's a time where the Socratic switch flips. You flip that switch of going from somebody who's passively receiving instruction to someone who's demanding that the doors of the library be thrown open. You want to shake the tree for more fruit. You want to be soil that's fertile. And when you're asking questions, then the professor can give you really great answers because there's already a receptivity in advance. And I think we need to be thinking a lot about the culture of schooling and whether or not it's creating more curiosity into the future or more passivity. And Dewey really wanted to create an environment that could be siloed off from a lot of the world because he didn't envision schooling as supplemental to parents and family. He regarded it as substitutionary. Dewey regarded the family as dangerous because there was too much diversity, and he wanted to create a homogenized experience where kids would have as the center of their sort of psychological heart of their upbringing would be the school, would be the center of their experience. I don't think we believe that. We Americans believe, not just we AEI conservatives, we Americans want the family and the neighborhood to be the center of kids' upbringing, and school is a really important tool to serve those larger ends of pursuing the good, the true, and the beautiful, and creating actually curious 14 and 17-year-olds.
Let me throw you an idea that's parallel to some of the things you write about in this book and get your reaction to it. As you know, as a Harvard grad, most of the older now elite universities in the United States, the original entering age of students was 13 years old. So originally Harvard took 13-year-old kids, which was the same age you'd go into an apprenticeship or have a trade. Same thing in Princeton, Yale, same deal. Now, that concept was militated against the notion of adolescence in a very real way. In point of fact, people didn't start talking about adolescence and the confusion that came with adolescence until the beginning of the 20th century. One has to ask oneself whether or not it's a modern concept and, in fact, an invention. And if it, in fact, is an invention, it seems to me that the point of your book is to militate against the concept of adolescence. How do you react to that?
I don't think I quite agree, because I would argue that there was an adolescent concept in the mind of those schools with in loco parentis. The idea wasn't that you were a truly independent adult when you went off to those institutions. It was that you were in a semi-independent state. You were sort of at a training wheels removal stage of life. So I think it was still adolescence, but it was using adolescence as a means to the end of graduation, right? We've all been to many commencements probably this month. I've spoken at 5 so far this month, and if you're underprepared and you need a go-to thing, just start talking about the word commencement and how odd it is. And this is the ceremony that ends your education, and yet we call it what? We call it the beginning. Because it's the beginning of the next stage. It's the beginning of you repaying your debts to the community. It's the beginning of adulthood, right? And so I think that model is still a really helpful way to think about moving. I'm not advocating that we send away our kids at age 13, but we should recognize their capacity to be sent away at age 13. And by sent away, we mean transitioning to that independent phase of life. Not get all the way there. Again, I celebrate adolescence. The 18-month to 4-year period where your body hit puberty, but you still don't have to be fully independent, that's a gift. If you don't live in a war-torn part of the world or in abject poverty, you have this greenhouse protected phase of life. I think that's pretty special, as long as we know that it's a means to an end. Melissa, my wife, and I talk about a lot of our parenting of teenagers as training wheels removal exercises. How can we get them from this thing to the stage where we want them to be sufficient enough that we trust them to make good decisions? I'm a no training wheels guy in life. I've trained all 3 of my kids to ride a bike and a lot of the neighborhood kids, and we have a pretty aggressive, rub some dirt in it philosophy of how we do it. We don't do bubble wrap in life in general, but when I'm teaching a kid to ride a bike, we do. So we wrap them up in ski clothes. You put a helmet on them, and you put on a big winter coat, and you put on ski pants, no training wheels, and we put the bike on a slight decline. And I run behind the bike, straddling the back wheel, and I bat them shoulder to shoulder like this. So they're falling down as the bike is shooting down this hill, right? And they're falling, and I'm just batting them until all of a sudden they catch, right? And they feel it. They get the balance, and all of a sudden they know how to ride a bike. Like, that's the goal. The goal isn't training wheels. The goal is for them to be able to ride their own bike next to you and go take in the sights and smell the flowers. And I think lots of parenting a teen is that kind of thing. How do you bat them just enough or have just enough training wheels on that you can take them off and they can ride independently?
Before we turn to the audience, I want you to start getting your questions ready. I'm going to ask one more question, which is about, not exactly about politics, it's about the political climate. You know, I spend a lot of my time talking about political polarization and how we need to answer the contempt that's crept up in political conversations with a greater sense of warm-heartedness and respect for each other. But you say in this book that political polarization is a much smaller problem than political or societal disengagement. Tell me about that threat.
Yeah, I think that elite consumers of media tend to believe that the world looks a lot like other elite consumers of media, and the data just doesn't bear that out. It is true that on cable news you can have channel A and channel B where it feels like their rhetorical worlds don't ever meet. I'm the third or fourth most conservative guy in the Senate by voting record, but I very self-consciously sit in Daniel Patrick Moynihan's desk on the floor of the Senate, and for two reasons. One, he's the author of the famous quote, "You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts." We do have a world where there's a decreasing sense of the importance of shared facts. That's a problem. The other Moynihanism is being aware of the breakdown of family structure in the 1960s. But I care about that rhetorical world where we don't have shared facts. But the much bigger point than the divide among certain cable news channels is just how few Americans are paying any attention to any of that. Whatever J-Lo did in the last 2 hours is between 20 and 200 times more important to the median American than whatever policy or political discussion is happening in DC. And so far more Americans are politically disengaged than are politically polarized. This place is just not that interesting, right? Partly because we're not dealing with the long-term generational challenges that the country faces. We're 28 years since the end of the Cold War, and we still have no national security strategy for the age of cyber and jihad. Non-state actors matter a ton, and we don't really have any shared way of thinking or talking about those problems. We give lots of examples like that where Republicans and Democrats, and again, I'm a very conservative guy, but Republicans and Democrats are too exhausted political parties. They don't have ideas for the challenges of 5 and 10 years from today. They want to refight the fights of the late 1960s over and over and over again, and everybody else is checking out. And so I think that there is a big problem of the sort of vacuousness of our public square, such that these political parties look like they might be ripe for hostile takeover. Oh, well, that's some of what we're going through right now. But we didn't really have a campaign that was focused on a clear set of policy agendas.
I hear J-Lo's running in 2020, by the way.
But you joke, but I actually do think that's what happens next. I think there's a very good chance that maybe not by the 2020 cycle, but by 2024 or 2028, I think people that bring a big Q rating are far more likely your presidential frontrunners than people who come out of these two political parties right now. It isn't by accident that Mark Zuckerberg is visiting every state in the union right now. It isn't by accident that Mark Cuban is looking at what third-party ballot access looks like in 20 or 30 states right now. I think if Oprah or George Clooney had been able to see into the 2016 cycle what we know now 2.5 years ago, I think you'd had a whole bunch more presidential candidates. I think it's highly likely that the future race is between J-Lo and LeBron.
I pine for the dystopian hell of Peter Pan. Right here in the front, and then we'll go back to the back here. Mark, yes, sir.
Senator, you started off by...
We got a microphone coming to you. I should have told you that first. If you could state your name and...
Mark Moisier. Senator, thank you for coming.
Good
At the beginning of your presentation, you said it's 98% not about policy. Tell us the 2% that is about policy.
Well, I think Arthur, in these last two questions, tried to get us there. So this book is not in any way about the 2016 race. The president is never mentioned in the book, and it's not at all about politics. It's mostly not about policy. It's about the cultural issues that are well upstream from policy and politics. But I have an afterword in the book that is essentially P.S. If it had been about policy, what would we talk about? And I think that it's about secondary and tertiary education and ultimately about job retraining. I think Salman Khan is one of the most interesting guys in American life, and you never hear him talked about in D.C. DC is going to fight about X, Y, or Z happening at the Department of Education. And it's amazing how many Americans think that the Department of Education has this sort of Rube Goldberg machine where they can push a button and it changes what's happening in classrooms all over America. 13% of K-12 education comes from the federal government. A majority of the regulatory constraints come from the federal government. But it's 13% of the money, and we're almost always fighting old fights about the current model of schooling. Salman Khan, for those of you who don't know him, Khan, Khan Academy, he is the most influential math teacher in the history of the world. He's not a math researcher, he's not a mathematician. He's a guy who's really good at teaching his niece math on a whiteboard, loading it up into 6 and 9 and 12-minute lessons on YouTube. And all of a sudden, when he's living in San Francisco doing private equity and he has a niece living in some city in Ohio and she has a pretty weak algebra teacher, he starts teaching her lessons every day and loading them up on YouTube, and all of a sudden 200 and 300, because it was cheap, it was lighter file than sending her an email. He just uses YouTube as the way to load it up. And all of a sudden 200,000 and 300,000 kids are watching his algebra lessons every day. And the Gates Foundation and others contact him, and he builds a foundation, and they say, hey, besides algebra, could you do geometry? What about trig? Could you do calculus? Hey, let's move sideways. Can we do physics? And he has millions and millions and millions of viewers. He's using this hybridized moment to expand the reach of really good teaching in a way that is supplemental to what's happening in the schools, but could be partially substitutionary if we were rethinking some of our models. Just one more sentence on this. When I was at Midland, accounting was our third largest major just when I arrived, and we had the potential for lots more demand in accounting, but the supply side was hard because we had all these tenured professors in departments that mostly didn't have students because of some of the bumps the school had gone through. And we were trying to figure out how could we be more cost effective and actually educationally effective, pedagogically effective in the service and education of our students. And so we did some looking at accounting, and we looked at all in person, all online, and hybrid delivery of accounting classes. And we would pat ourselves on the back all the time because we had about a 40-to-1 student to teacher ratio in our accounting classes. And the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the big flagship school in the state, had a really good accounting department too. And they had 300-to-1 classes. And we thought we were so superior because 40-to-1 is so much better than 300-to-1. It turns out in the data, it makes almost no difference because 40-to-1 is already so far beyond a seminar experience that there are 5 nerds that talk all the time in a 40-to-1 class or in a 300-to-1 class, and they become the feedback loop for the professor. And he or she thinks they know what the students are learning and what they're stuck at, but the kids who are talking are not representative of the kids who are not talking. And so it turns out, as you probably would expect, all in person, most expensive, all online, the cheapest, hybrid, middle. But what we wouldn't guess is that pedagogically, in terms of student comprehension, hybrid was by far the best, then all in person, then all online. So the hybrid experience gave you a relationship with a professor, it gave you a tutor to help clear your bottlenecks, but the online portion of our classes created high frequency, low stakes quizzing, where the professor got feedback loops on the fact that these 40 kids or these 300 kids were bottlenecked at a whole bunch of different places. If you look what Salman Khan is doing, there are all sorts of potential there's all sorts of potential to blow up the model of education going forward in ways that are plural and diverse and supplemental, not just substitutionary.
We're going to go to the back, right back here. We've got a mic coming to you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Devorah.
Hello.
Hi. So you talked a bit about the passivity of students today, and what struck me about a lot of the campus unrest is that the students tend to behave as though they're passive victims of their own emotions. Not so much the speakers, but their own feelings are the things that scare them the most. And something that struck me a bit was, I recently read I'm reading Alan Bloom's Closing of the Campus Mind, and he talks about how the self is sort of a modern substitute for the soul, which tends to mean that people look for themselves and try to figure out basically what their feelings are telling them is what it comes down to mean. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this idea of the self sort of being a tyrant to individual students in terms of them not being in control of their emotions kind of being an enemy or a friend, depending on whatever situation they happen to be in.
Wow.
Which is a bit of an esoteric question.
No, it's a great question. We were going to break in about 10 minutes, but instead we're just going to stay for 3 hours and just do that. Because there's so much meat there. I'm facetious on the time, but I'm serious on the meat of your question. I've been doing a lot of media around the book. Vanishing American Adult came out a week ago today. And I've been surprised at how many people bring up Bloom. It's the 30th anniversary of the closing of the American Mind. E.D. Hirsch's Cultural Literacy was the same year. This is right about the time that Jesse Jackson is marching through Palo Alto, helping Stanford students protest a core curriculum with hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. And so some of it is easy historical bookmarking of the 30 years. But I do think when you talked about the passivity of the students and the way we think about the passions, right? There are really big and important philosophical debates here about why the human soul is broken. Reasonable people can differ about why the human soul is broken. Only insane people would say there's no brokenness here. And so I try to play out Augustine versus Rousseau for a little bit of the book to think about some of the questions about where this brokenness originates. But it is useful to be able to have a Greek debate about what it means that we have these passions that do seem to act and be acted upon in ways we should unbundle. But if you're going to be a deliberative adult, if you're going to be somebody who's capable of self-governance because you believe in the necessity of self-control and self-discipline and self-restraint, you can't just be at the whim of your passions. And one of the dangers of creating echo chambers, not only in the safe space movement on campus, but in the way we consume media, is that you do become a lot weaker and softer if you only have to engage with people who already think exactly what you think. That's not a healthy place to be. The healthy place to be is with other adults where you have some important disagreements and you can actually love them enough to care about them, even though we don't come to full agreement about all these questions, but we care about continuing to argue because we want to be persuaded where we're wrong and we want to persuade people we love.
Right here on this side, then we'll go back here to we'll go over to this side and then we'll go to the back, and these will be the last three questions.
Good afternoon, Senator Sasse. My name is Todd Wiggins. Very enjoyable presentation here. So I would like to see a visual, and if you can imagine an opportunity where you thought you were right, but it turns out that your conclusions turned out to be contradictory to the truth, where you actually looked yourself in the face and said, you know what, I could retool my approach to this, and where you found that humility was the better part of your persona that you were able to share with your kids.
Wow, that's great. Instead of doing a big one, because I might get lost and be so introspective that I'll violate my German Lutheran upbringing. We're stoic by nature. I'll give you maybe three quickies. One is I have a chapter on literacy in the book that's not about functional literacy, but it's about becoming actually appetitively literate. We want our kids to be people who want to read. We want them to return to a few books that are meaningful and have dialogue partners that they continue to wrestle with. We want them to have shared conversations with other people around those books. And we want them to have a reading list going forward into the future. And so I didn't want to have a national canon debate in the book, but I wanted to have this exercise of how do you build a personal canon? And so I wanted to argue about the subgenres that would be in that. And I just kept taking books off my shelves for weeks. My wife and I sort of wrestling and reshuffling books. What if we decided to create a canon that was only 60 books long? And you couldn't have more than that, and no subgenre could have more than 5 books, and so you needed 12 categories, and you keep moving books around. What are the books that I want to go to again and again? It was a great exercise for us as a family. And I found that I would have never thought that one of the genres I would put in this book would be conversion narratives. And yet I found so many of the books that I cared most about were kind of conversion narratives. And so that isn't a direct answer to your question, but it's a way of thinking about so many of the people that we respect in our lives are people who've wrestled through big enough questions that they could decide they might have even been wrong about fundamental theological and worldview kinds of questions. A second one is, I would say, just to your point about humility, I've been wrestling with in some of my business work in the past, when you try to turn around an institution that's broken, that's either growing too fast and can't manage the growth, or it's going through bankruptcy, this sort of capacity of leaders to be persuasive enough that people want to follow them. They have to believe in something. They can't be willy-nilly, and yet no good leader thinks you know all the answers at the beginning. How do you simultaneously lead and grapple with continuing to grow in humility, right? Well, there are categories of knowing certain unknowns and having unknown unknowns, but being able to kind of lay out the cards of what I think I know in a given situation to get to a place where I can, in deliberation with a board or an executive team, decide that's the far spot on the shoreline we should be aiming toward, and how we may revise it as we go. It's a lot more effective to be trying to kayak across a windy lake and have a destination and then have to correct at some mid-course point than just not really ever have a fixed point that you're heading toward and working like this. And I'll maybe just say a little tiny additional one just because it's so current in my life. I had a big and healthy argument with Mitch McConnell when I first got here, where I wanted Article 1 of the Constitution to be the place where all deliberation about legislation happened, and I want the Article 2 branch, the executive, to just be the place where the president is the commander-in-chief, so especially in times of national security emergency, there are some pretty extraordinary powers. But by and large, a president's job is to faithfully execute the laws that have been passed by the Congress. And I thought that the Congress is way too passive about deliberating about big things. I still believe that normatively, but descriptively, I'm increasingly of the view that it's almost impossible in a TV and digital age for a legislature to actually be the policy initiating body. And so I think you need the power of the bully pulpit to set a national agenda. And so I've come to a place where I still want the legislature to lead more, but I think I'm more aware of the actual limitations of the legislature to be able to lead. I think you need somebody who can compel a bully pulpit. And I don't like to be wrong. I don't like to tell Mitch McConnell I'm wrong, and I don't like to tell my kids that I had an argument with Mitch, 24 months ago, and then I had to go and tell him I was wrong. But it's pretty useful for them to have seen their dad do that when they need to go back to their hockey coach and say, hey, you were right when you were trying to get me to train this way, and I was arguing with you. You knew better than I did.
We have time for two quick ones. So we'll go quick question here, and then quick question there, and we'll wrap.
Thank you for taking selfie with me earlier. My question is, so you said recently that adolescents after college are able to function as adults. Is government, especially its role in providing college loans, partially to blame?
I do think that one of the reasons that tuition continues to grow in America without demonstrable higher quality, lower cost alternatives out there is because we view so many things as simply push side policy questions. And because Arthur is flagging that we're at time, I won't go long here. I'll simply say, it's not by accident that American healthcare and American education are two of the least impressive segments of the U.S. economy, right? Why? What is similar between American education and American healthcare? They're both dominated by third-party payment. That third-party payment is primarily governmental. That means that you disempower the student, taxpayer, consumer, and the patient, taxpayer, consumer, citizen. And both of them are similar in that the actual experience of really great education and really great healthcare is ultimately about the system and the culture and the continuity of care. It's not primarily about the rock star professor on the stage or the rock star surgeon in the operating room. It's a lot more about nursing and about the handoffs of care after surgery. It's a lot more about the community and the culture that's built at an institution, a school or a college, than just about the one great professor. We've all been shaped by one great professor. That's wonderful. But some of why we don't get that systemic culture is because we think we can fix it by having different governmental levers decreed on the input side. And so I do think that the way we fund higher education doesn't have enough pull variable to it and has way too much push.
Last question in the back. Yes, sir.
Senator, thanks for these great ideas. I want to call on your experience as a college president. Most American college students full-time work 11 hours or less preparing for class. What's the how-to manual for other college leaders to turn around that corrupt and broken culture and really start preparing people for the challenges of citizenship and career?
Yeah, great question. There is a bunch of data, the old Carnegie numbers about the reason we supposedly take 12 hours or sometimes 15 hours as a full load is because the assumption was that you should do 3 hours of preparation outside class for every hour inside class. And since 1990, the University of Chicago has had, actually I might not get all the numbers right, but there are some studies, lots of them associated with University of Chicago, where over 30 years they've looked at how much students actually study outside class for every hour inside. And this old model of 3 hours per one in, it's more like half an hour outside class for every hour in. And so our students end up with a very, very insufficient demand on their ultimate time for those who are full-time engaged in a full-time residential institution. And we should recognize that the vast majority of students are not that. They're a 28-year-old who's at their third institution, working full-time, raising kids. So we need to pluralize the way we think about our models for higher education and also our policy inputs to this. But for the traditional residential student, I think one of the things that has to happen is more schools need to strike out, to venture out, saying we want to build something better and more interesting for you than the sort of median American experience. And don't come to this institution if you don't already have lots and lots of pregnant questions. If there's not a lot you want to learn and a lot you want to achieve during your time here, if you're not striving and we're sort of the passive providers of you, the actively engaged learning student, this is the wrong place for you. The last thing we should be telling our kids is come to our higher education institution and we'll give you total training wheels and spoon feeding, because it's not healthy for them. These are people who are bodily adults by 6 years by the time they're arriving. And so we need to create an institution where they think they've been given the opportunity to go to a giant, I'm not meaning to use the word cafeteria buffet as a way to argue against an old core curriculum, but you want to view it as if they're coming to an institution that's a cornucopia of really curious and interesting people and ideas and inputs and labs and libraries. And they want to demand things out of this institution, not be spoon-fed by this institution. And right now there's not enough cultural diversity in the institutional form of our higher education where we're saying, come and wrestle us to the ground at this place.
We're out of time, and I want to thank all of you for joining us here at AEI. If this is your first event at AEI, please come again. We do about 300 events a year in this beautiful space, and we have a lot more spaces in this building doing a lot more things. You are welcome here. You should consider this to be one of your intellectual homes. Second thing I'd like to bring up is if you enjoyed this discussion here, please get Senator Sasse's book. Please get 2 copies and send the second one to somebody who needs to hear this but who wasn't here with us today. And third of all, please join me in thanking Ben Sasse.
Thanks. Appreciate you. Thanks a lot.